If my story is chosen, I will send the link to my friends because they doubted me when I told this story. It was a night like any other. The clock was over 10 and the tiredness of the day was beginning to weigh. I was thrown on the couch, still with the work clothes, the TV light flashing while any show passed. The silence of the house was almost comforting, but there was a restlessness inside me. That feeling that he needed to do something, anything, to escape monotony. It was then that I took the phone and opened Google Maps. It was a silly but recurring habit. Exploring random places around the world gave me a strange feeling of adventure, as if I could travel without leaving the place. I started with the basics, cities I always wanted to visit, small villages lost in deserts, remote islands. As I clicked and dragging, I distanced myself from the best known places and diving into less exploited regions. I don't know if it has happened to you, but sometimes I feel that Google Maps has a life of its own. It is as if, suddenly, he guided me to the corners that I would never seek on my own. And that's exactly what happened that night. After playing with Street View in a European little town, I returned to the general map. There was something curious in a remote road area inside a country that I did not recognize immediately. There was no nearby city, no sign of other structures, but an icon caught my attention: a cemetery. Nothing extraordinary in this at first. Cemeteries appear on the map all the time, but this one had something different. First, the name, or rather, the lack of it. In the place where there should be a title, it was only cemetery in generic letters. No description, no additional information, nothing that indicated your exact story or location. Moved by pure curiosity, I increased the zoom and opened the Street View. The first image carried a certain delay, as if the place was hiding even from Google servers. When it finally appeared, I felt a shiver run down the spine. It was hard to explain why, but there was something uncomfortable in that scene. The rusty iron gate marked the entrance, but there was no sign of life nearby. No signs, no flowers, nothing that indicated recent visits. The surrounding trees looked dead, dry and twisted branches that projected themselves against the sky like hands asking for help. I kept exploring the place by clicking on the available images. The cemetery seemed bigger than I imagined, with a dirt path that serpented between the tombstone. The feeling of abandonment was evident. Listed stones, moss covering what should once have been important inscriptions, and an absolute silence that could almost be felt even through the screen. The strangest, however, was the quality of the images. Some parts were clear, others looked blurred, as if something had interfered the moment the cameras captured that place. I laughed nervously. It must be a processing error, I thought, but I couldn't take your eyes off the screen. There was something in the images that pulled me, as if the cemetery wanted to be seen. I clicked to advance one more time, and that's when I noticed a shadow, far, almost imperceptible. It seemed to be in the lower corner of the image, next to an isolated tombstone. At first I thought it was just part of the landscape, perhaps an effect of the sun or an out of place. But with every movement she made, she was still there at different angles, as if she followed me as I walked virtually through that space. This is strange, I muttered to myself. It was late, I was alone at home, and the idea of a dark cemetery in the middle of nowhere was already weighing. Even so, curiosity was greater than discomfort. I decided to give another click to advance the Street View trail, but the screen froze. I stared at the cell phone, hoping to carry. A few seconds later, he finally returned, but the image was different. Now looked darker. The sky, which was once a pale gray, was almost black. The shadow that was once in the corner now seemed bigger, closer. This time it was impossible to ignore. It had human form. My breath accelerated. It made no sense. It was just a map, just a sequence of photos taken by an automatic car. There should be nothing there, nothing that moved. I closed the app, but my mind continued to rotate. Who or what could that figure be? I tried to convince myself that it was just a visual error, perhaps a reflex badly captured by the camera. But I couldn't avoid uncomfortable thinking. It looked like that shadow was looking straight at me. Still, something inside me insisted that I needed to go back and look again, as if that cemetery had pulled me to his orbit and not to let me go so easily. I opened Google Maps again and typed the same address, but the icon was gone. The cemetery was simply no longer there. The first thing that caught my attention was the gate, old iron, with the bent stems and missing pieces. There was no recorded name, no inscriptions that gave a clue about the place. It was just an entrance to something that seemed to have been forgotten for time. But what really made me uncomfortable was the general condition of the environment. The trees around were dead, with twisted branches that intertwined above the tombstone, as if the cemetery itself tried to hide from the outside world. The floor was covered with dry leaves, creating an orange rug that seemed to absorb any trace of life. I advanced through the street view, clicking to explore the dirt path. The headships were in a deplorable state. Some were so old that it could barely distinguish inscriptions. Others were cracked, listed, or covered with moss. There was something oppressive in that place, as if even technology had difficulty capturing it. With each new image he carried, he realized that the edges were blurred, and the colors seemed faded, as if the sunlight had never really reached that place. As I kept clicking, something started to get my attention. It was a distant, almost imperceptible shadow at the bottom of one of the images. At first I thought it was just a shrub or a spot in the lens, but the feeling of discomfort grew. With each new movement through the cemetery, the shadow seemed to be there, always at the same angle, as if following me. I laughed nervously. It must just be an error in the processing of images, I thought, trying to ignore the cold in the spine. But something in the shape of that shadow bothered me. It wasn't just a blur. She looked human. It was tall and narrow, with contours that suggested shoulders and head. No matter where I clicked, there she was, always present as a silent viewer. After a few minutes, my curiosity became restless. My mind was trying to rationalize what I saw, but my body reacted otherwise. The silence of the house seemed heavier, almost oppressive, as if the environment around me had absorbed the energy of that cemetery. My hands began to sweat, and I realized that I was holding my breath. It was just a map, I told myself, trying to ignore the tightness in my chest. I gave another click, approaching a lonely tombstone next to a dead tree. The shadow, which was once distant, now seemed to be closer, positioned behind the tombstone. "It makes no sense," I muttered, feeling the warmth of tension rising through my neck. It was impossible for something in the image to move with such consistency. It was just a sequence of photos taken by an automatic car, nothing more. I decided to do something I normally never do at Street View back. I clicked to back down, trying to see if the shadow disappeared or changed places. But to my horror, she was still there in the same relative position, as if waiting for me. The feeling of being observed grew, even though he knew it was impossible. But was it really? I started to question whether what I saw was real or just my mind preaching pieces. Suddenly my cell phone crashed. The image froze, showing the now more defined shadow in the center of the screen. I tried to close the app, but it just didn't respond. My heart fired. For a moment, I thought I heard something, a distant sound coming from the next room, like a slight scratch, but perhaps it was just my imagination, amplified by the nervousness. When the app finally unlocked, the shadow was disappeared. Initial relief was quickly replaced by even greater discomfort. Where was she? I felt like I had lost sight of something I should never have escaped. The darkness in the images seemed deeper, the colder colors, and the silence around me heavier. This is not normal, I whispered to myself, trying to ignore the shiver that roamed my spine. I thought of closing Google Maps and erasing that cemetery from my memory, but something stopped me. It was as if the place had stuck to me, demanding that I continued. Even with the discomfort, I returned to the cemetery entrance by clicking on the starting point of the street view. And then I saw something that made my heart stop for a second. The shadow was there, just behind the gate. This time, closer, clearer, almost tangible. My fingers trembled as I pressed the screen, trying to broaden the image. I wanted to see better, to understand what that was, but I also feared discovering the answer. Before you could do anything, the screen blinked and returned to the general map. Street View had closed alone, and the cemetery, well, he just wasn't there anymore. 2 days passed, but the cemetery didn't come out of my head. I tried to follow my routine normally, but it was as if something was pulling me back. The shadow, the broken tombstones, the rusty gate, Everything seemed to have nailed roots into my mind. As much as he tried to forget, a question hammered incessantly. What is that place? On the second day, almost without realizing it, I found myself researching the address on the map again. It was an irrational impulse, as if something beyond my will was guiding me. In the late afternoon, I took the car keys. The road was exactly as it appeared on the map, narrow, surrounded by dense trees, with few signs indicating directions. As I approached me, I realized that the cell phone signal disappeared. I looked at the device on the passenger seat. No bars, no connection. The silence was absolute. No bird sounds, no wind noise between the leaves. The only thing he heard was the snoring of the engine and occasionally the irregular asphalt ranger under the tires. When I finally saw the cemetery gate, a strange sensation took over me. It was as if the air around it was colder, heavier. The gate was exactly as in the street view, rusty, crooked, with peeling painting exposing a gray and dead tone. I stopped the car at the entrance and got out, hesitating. There was no one around, no house or sign of civilization. It was just me in that place. It's just a cemetery. I muttered to myself, trying to sound more confident than it really was. I took a step forward and pushed the gate. He ranged loudly, the sound echoing like a scream in the silence. Inside, everything seemed even more decaying than in the images. The smell of wet earth and rotten wood invaded my nostrils, while the floor, covered with dried leaves, seemed to cushion my steps. The head chits were scattered in a disorderly way, some partially buried on the floor, some inclined at impossible angles. The moss covering the stones gave the place an air of abandonment, as if no one had stepped there in decades. I walked slowly, reading the names that were still visible. Most were unreadable, erased by time, but some inscriptions resisted, letting out dates that dating back to the 19th century. As I advanced, a growing restlessness took over me. It was hard to explain, but I had the feeling of being observed. With each new step, he looked over his shoulder, hoping to find something between the trees or behind the tombstone. But there was nothing, just the silence, heavy and suffocating, that seemed to mock my nervousness. It was then that I saw her. The tombstone was isolated, partially hidden by a twisted tree. Something in that stone seemed to call me. I approached slowly, my heart hitting hard, almost painful. When I was close enough to read, my body froze. My name was recorded there in cold and perfect letters. At first I thought it was coincidence, maybe someone with the same name as mine. But as I bowed, I noticed something that made the floor seem to disappear under my feet. My picture, it was not an old or generic image. It was exactly the same as I used in my work badge. I stood there, trying to understand, while the panic was starting to take care. Below the photo, the dates completed the terrifying scenario. My birth was correct, and the date of death? It was the next day. This cannot be real. I murmured backwards instinctively. My eyes burned, as if my brain refused to process what I saw. I tried to rationalize. Someone should be playing with me. But how? Who could have access to that photo? And why would you choose to put it there? My heart beat so fast that I could hear it in the ears. His hand shaved as I tried to get his cell phone out of his pocket to record it. But to my surprise, the screen was still without a sign. I knew to get out of there. Every fiber of my being shouted that this place was not safe. But as I turned around to run, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. It was low, almost imperceptible, as if someone was breathing heavily behind me. My whole body refused to move. Don't look, I thought, with the instinct that something terrible would happen if I turned my face. But curiosity, or perhaps fear, overcame me. Slowly, I turned my head. Behind the tombstone, exactly where the shadow appeared on the street view, something was there. I can't describe accurately. It was not human, but it was not completely different either. It had an indefinite form, almost as if made of smoke or condensed darkness. And although I had no visible eyes, I felt I was looking straight at me. Without thinking, I ran. The gate seemed to be miles away, but I didn't look back. I only heard the sound of my own steps, and perhaps a distant whisper I couldn't understand. I got in the car, connected the engine, and accelerated without looking at the rearview mirror. When I finally reached the main road, the cell phone signal came back, but the cemetery address had disappeared from the map. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, get out of it as soon as possible, but my legs just didn't obey. It was as if the ground had become an invisible trap, holding my feet with a force that was not physical, but something deeper, something I couldn't understand. Every muscle of my body begged to move, but the only thing I managed to do was spin my eyes, desperate, looking for something that explained what was happening. It was then that the shadows appeared. They were there just as I had seen on Google Maps, but now they were real in a way that made the air around me seem denser, heavier. The shadows moved between the tombstone and the trees, as if they float without a sound. They were tall, indistinct contours, made of a darkness that seemed to devour the low light that existed in that place. The worst was the way they seemed to watch me, without eyes, but with the attention I felt to the bottom of my soul. The absolute silence was broken by a low sound, almost imperceptible at first. Whispers, unconnected phrases that seemed to come from all directions at the same time, surrounding me as a growing wave. It was hard to understand what they said, but there was something about them that hit me like a blow. These were words that I did not recognize, but somehow they sounded family members, as if he had heard them in a dream or nightmare long forgotten. "What is that?" I whispered, without waiting for an answer. My voice sounded weak, almost swallowed by the whispers around me. The air seemed colder now, cutting my skin like invisible blades. My eyes wandered through the cemetery, trying to find something, anything that could control me about the situation. It was then that I saw my reflection. There was a polished tombstone beside me, partially covered with moss, but still reflecting the pale light of the environment. In the reflection, however, it was not me, or at least not the self I expected to see. It was an older version of myself, with cluttered hair and back, empty eyes. The expression on the face was of indescribable suffering, as if stuck in a cycle of endless pain. "It can't be," I muttered, my heart beating so hard that it seemed to explode in my chest. I blinked a few times, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind preaching pieces. But the reflection did not disappear. He stared at me, immovable, as I fought to breathe. Suddenly, one of the shadows approached. I saw her on the corner of her eye, sliding between the tombstone as a predator who found her prey. An intense cold passed my body, as if it had been touched by something not human. It was at this moment that the whispers increased, becoming almost deafening. The words, once indecipherable, now seemed to graduate in sentences, but still disconnected. "You can't escape. It's too late, you already knew," I shouted. I don't know if the sound really came out or was just inside my head, but at that moment it all darkened. It was as if the world around me had been swallowed by darkness itself. There were no more trees, tumblings, or shadows. Just an absolute void, where I felt small, insignificant, as if it were a lost particle in an infinite ocean. A sudden pain traveled my chest, as if something was squeezing me inside. My eyes burned, but I couldn't close them. All I could do was face the emptiness, as the whispers turned into a single continuous, severe and vibrant sound that seemed to resonate in the bones of my body. And then, in a moment that lasted an eternity, a clear voice came in the middle of chaos. It was neither male nor female, but I had an authority that made me tremble. "You saw what you shouldn't. Now it's part of it." I woke up in the same place, but everything was different. The shadows had disappeared. The intense cold gave way to stuffy heat, and the cemetery seemed more abandoned than before. My legs finally obeyed, and I ran. I ran without looking back, regardless of the sound of my own steps echoing on the dirt floor. The rusty gate seemed farther away than before, but I continued, driven by a primal fear I had never felt before. When I reached the car, I entered quickly and knocked the door. I connected the engine, but my hands trembled so much that I almost dropped the key. As I accelerated, I looked at the rearview mirror, waiting to see something following me. But there was nothing. The cemetery was there, immovable, as if it was all a nightmare. For a moment, I thought I was saved, but then I saw my reflection in the rearview mirror. It wasn't me. It was that version of me I saw on the tombstone, and she smiled. When I woke up, I was in the car, parked in front of my house. I have no idea how I got there. My hands were still holding the wheel, and the engine was off, but the last thing I remember was to be running through the cemetery with those shadows chasing me. My heart was still accelerating, and the air inside the car seemed heavy, as if the threat was still present, only invisible. I entered the trembling home. My mind tried to find some logic for what had happened. I went straight to the computer. I opened Google Maps, looking for the cemetery address, but it was no longer there. No marking, no reference. It was as if that place had never existed. I thought of trying other maps, forums, anything, but a part of me knew it would be useless. It was as if something or someone had erased all the evidence, leaving only the experience recorded in my memory. I spent the rest of the night looking out the window, hoping to see some movement on the street, something that confirmed it was safe. But the silence around me seemed much bigger than it should be. Since then, it has been so. Even now, as I tell you this story, I feel that I am not completely alone. I see nothing, but it is as if those shadows still watched me, waiting for the right time to reappear. I still try to convince myself that it was just a dream, a hallucination caused by tiredness or my own brain preaching pieces. But deep down, there is something that keeps me from believing it. That tombstone with my name and my picture is still engraved in my mind. Was it just a warning? Or a kind of sentence I still don't understand? I have never entered Google Maps since that day. And honestly, I don't know if you should come in either. Some things were not made to be discovered. Perhaps sometimes it is best to let the hidden places remain hidden. After all, who knows what else may be waiting to be found? And this was one of our followers' stories. If you want your story to be told by us as well, leave it in the comments below this video. And if you enjoyed this video and want to see more content like this, we prepared the next video especially for you. Click here to watch it,